In Module 6.3, we consider the topic of bone formation. Now, the growth of your skeleton determines the size and the proportions of your body. The bony skeleton begins to form as early as 6 weeks after fertilization, when an embryo is only about half an inch long. Now, at this time, all skeletal elements are made of cartilage. Bone growth continues through childhood and adolescence, and portions of the skeleton generally do not stop growing until about age 25. During development, bone replaces cartilage, or in some cases, other connective tissues, like fibrous connective tissue. I'll explain in a moment. The process of replacing other tissues with bone is called ossification. Now, there are two forms of ossification. The first, intramembranous ossification. Here, bone develops within sheets or membranes of connective tissue, hence the name intra for within, membranous ossification. The sheets are made from mesenchymal cells, which are embryonic stem cells, in fibrous connective tissues. This fibrous connective tissue is found beneath the dermis. In endochondral ossification, bone replaces existing cartilage, typically hyaline cartilage. I must clarify that there is a difference between ossification and calcification. Calcification is simply the deposition of calcium salts. Calcification takes place during ossification, but it can also take place in tissues other than bone. Figure 6.4 on the next slide will show some of the bones that are formed by these two processes in a 16-week-old fetus. Intramembranous ossification takes place in development of the bones of the skull, the mandibles, and the collarbones, or clavicles. All other bones of the human body form through endochondral ossification. Therefore, our focus will be on endochondral ossification. Let's look briefly for a moment, however, at some of the details of intramembranous ossification. In intramembranous ossification, mesenchymal stem cells mature or specialize or differentiate into osteoblasts. This takes place in fetal fibrous connective tissue beneath the dermis in the skull. The osteoblasts differentiate from embryonic stem cells or mesenchymal cells after the organic components of the matrix, secreted by the stem cells, becomes calcified. Ossification first occurs in what is called an ossification center. As ossification proceeds and new bone branches outward, some osteoblasts get trapped inside bony pockets and they mature or differentiate into osteocytes. Bone growth is an active process, and osteoblasts require oxygen and they require nutrients. So blood vessels begin to grow into the area to meet those demands. Over time, the blood vessels get trapped within the developing bone. Now, at first, the intramembranous bone resembles spongy bone. Further remodeling around the trapped blood vessels can produce osteons that are typical of compact bone. The flat bones of the skull, the lower jaw or mandibles, and the collarbones or clavicles form through intramembranous ossification. The most common form of ossification is endochondral ossification. Most bones of the skeleton form through endochondral ossification, which quite literally means inside the cartilage. This takes place through ossification of existing hyaline cartilage. The cartilages develop first and serve as miniature models of future bone. By the time an embryo is 6 weeks old, these cartilage models begin to be replaced by true bone. Steps in the growth and ossification of a limb are diagrammed in figure 6.5 on the next slide. Let's look a little more closely at this figure. You will see at the bottom of the slide that I've posted a link to a YouTube video which takes you through more detail concerning this image. It's optional if you'd like to watch it or if it helps give you a better understanding of the diagram. I will also add at this time, if you look at the notes beneath the slide or move to the next 2 slides in the presentation if you've downloaded it, you will see that I've taken you through the 5 steps in bullet point form. I will run through these bullet points while looking at the image on this current slide. First, endochondral ossification starts as chondrocytes. Those are cartilage cells. Within the growing cartilage model, enlarge. Their surrounding matrix begins to calcify. The chondrocytes die because the calcified matrix slows the diffusion of nutrients. Second, bone formation first occurs at the shaft surface. This, although not labeled here, is sometimes called a bone collar around the periphery of the bone at the shaft surface. Blood vessels grow around the edges of the cartilage, and cells of the perichondrium differentiate into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts begin producing a superficial layer around the bone shaft. 3. Blood vessels invade the interior region of the cartilage, along with migrating fibroblasts that differentiate into osteoblasts. The new osteoblasts form spongy bone within the center of the shaft at a primary ossification center. Bone development proceeds toward either end, filling the diaphysis with spongy bone. 4. As the bone lengthens, osteoclasts break down some of the spongy bone and create a marrow cavity. The cartilages found at the ends of the bone, that is the epiphyseal cartilages, or epiphyseal plates, on the ends continue to enlarge, increasing the length of the developing bone. Osteoblasts from the shaft continuously invade the epiphyseal cartilages, but the bone grows longer because a new cartilage is continuously added in front of the advancing osteoblasts. The textbook publishers liken this to a pair of joggers, one in front of the other. As long as they run at the same speed, the one in back will never catch the one in front. So too with the cartilage cells and the osteoblasts. So long as the chondrocytes are dividing and the osteoblasts are dividing at the same rate, the bone continues to lengthen, but the osteoblasts do not overtake the chondrocytes. 5. The centers of the epiphyses begin to calcify. As blood vessels and osteoblasts enter into those areas, secondary ossification centers form. The epiphyses eventually become filled with spongy bone. A thin cap of the original cartilage model, that is hyaline cartilage, remains exposed to the joint cavity as articular cartilage. At this stage, the bone of the shaft and the bone of each epiphysis are still separated by epiphyseal cartilage. As long as the rate of cartilage growth keeps pace with the rate of osteoblast invasion, the epiphyseal cartilage persists and the bone continues to grow longer. When sex hormone production increases at puberty, bone growth speeds up. The osteoblasts begin to produce bone faster than the epiphyseal cartilages expand. As a result, the epiphyseal cartilages at each end of the bone get increasingly narrower until they disappear. In adults, the former location of the epiphyseal cartilage is marked by a distinct line called the epiphyseal line. This can actually be seen in X-rays. The end of epiphyseal growth is called epiphyseal closure. The precise timing of epiphyseal closure varies from bone to bone and individual to individual. Ossification of the toes may be complete by the age of 11, but portions of the pelvis or wrist may enlarge until the age of 25. The epiphyseal cartilages in the arms and legs usually close by 18 in women or the age of 20 in men. Differences in sex hormones account for variations in body size and proportions between men and women. Thus far, we have discussed growth in bone length. While the bone lengthens, its diameter also enlarges. This enlargement is called appositional growth, and it occurs as cells of the periosteum. The periosteum is a covering of the bone which has two layers, an outer fibrous layer and an inner cellular layer. It is the inner cellular layer that develop into osteoblasts and produce additional bony matrix. As new bone is deposited on the outer surface of the shaft, the inner surface is eaten away or eroded by osteoclasts, and the marrow cavity gradually enlarges. Thus, new bone is laid down at the outer periphery of the bone, while the marrow cavity is enlarged by osteoclasts from the center. Let's look at each of the stages of appositional growth one at a time. First, the infant stage. As the bone lengthens, it also enlarges in diameter. During childhood, Osteoblasts deposit new bone on the outer surface, and osteoclasts erode bone from the inner surfaces, enlarging the marrow cavity. Here you can see bone being resorbed by osteoclasts at the center, while bone is being deposited by osteoblasts at the periphery. Third, early in adulthood, the marrow cavity continues to enlarge as bone is added to the outer surface and eroded on the inner surface. Later in adulthood, osteoblasts and osteoclasts continue to remodel the bone to adapt to stresses encountered during our daily activity. Normal bone growth and maintenance depend on a reliable source of various minerals, especially calcium salts. During prenatal development, these minerals are absorbed from the mother's bloodstream. The demands are so great that the maternal skeleton often loses bone mass during pregnancy. From infancy to adulthood, the diet has to provide adequate amounts of calcium and phosphate. The body must also be able to absorb and transport these minerals to sites of bone formation. You may also recall from Module 5.3, I'll put a link in the card above, of the importance of sunlight in producing vitamin D3. Again, vitamin D3 plays an important role in normal calcium metabolism. Vitamin D3 can be manufactured by epidermal cells of the skin exposed to UV radiation, or it can also be obtained from dietary supplements. After vitamin D3 is processed by your liver, the kidneys convert a derivative of this vitamin into calcitriol. That's a hormone that stimulates the absorption of calcium and phosphate ions in the digestive tract. Any deficiency of vitamin D3 can lead to softening of the bones as a result of poor mineralization. This disorder we saw in Module 5.3 is called osteomalacia in adults and rickets in children. In growing children, affected individuals develop a bow-legged appearance as the leg bones bend laterally under the weight of the body. Vitamin A and C are also essential for normal bone growth and maintenance. For example, a deficiency of vitamin C can cause scurvy. In this condition, a reduction of osteoblast activity leads to weak and brittle bones. Beyond these minerals, various hormones are also essential to normal skeletal growth and development. They include growth hormone, thyroid hormone, sex hormones, and hormones involved in calcium metabolism. We will learn more about the hormones of the endocrine system in Module 10. Let's briefly review the checkpoint questions from the textbook publisher. First, during intramembranous ossification, which type of tissue is replaced by bone? Well, during intramembranous ossification, it is fibrous connective tissue of the deep dermis that is replaced by bone, whereas in endochondral ossification, it is hyaline cartilage. 8. How could x-rays of the femur be used to determine if a person has reached full height? An x-ray of the femur or any of the long bones would indicate whether epiphyseal cartilage, which separates the epiphysis from the diaphysis, is still present. If present, then growth is still occurring. If absent, the bone has reached its full length. 9. A child who enters puberty several years later than the average age is generally taller than average as an adult. Why is this? The reason for this is that growth continues throughout childhood. At puberty, a growth spurt occurs. Then that is followed by closure of the epiphyseal cartilages. The later puberty begins, the taller the child will be at the start of the growth spurt. So when growth is completed, the individual will be taller than individuals who began puberty earlier. 10. Why are pregnant women given calcium supplements and encouraged to drink milk even though their skeletons are fully formed? The answer here is, pregnant women need large amounts of calcium to support bone growth in a developing fetus. If an expectant mother does not take enough calcium in her diet, her body will metabolize the calcium reserves of her own skeleton to provide for the needs of the fetus, resulting in weakened bones in the mother, as well as increased risk of fracture. Join me in Module 6.4 as we discuss bone remodeling and the various types of commonly occurring bone fractures.